today. Yesterday I was Skyping with my daughter down in Peru, and we were watching her, and suddenly she says, I think I was just in an earthquake. And she says, I hear this rumbling. And sure enough, there was an earthquake about 40 miles epicentered from where she was at. It's good that when you Skype with your daughter, the earthquakes happen then. That way you know they're okay, in the midst of it. We're in a series now dealing with marriage, though there's application to everyone, whether you're married or not. But today we're going to be talking about the responsibilities of a steward in marriage. Marriage is a combining and a joining of a family of two people together and of becoming one. And this is summarized in Genesis 2, verse 24. And let's read this together. In respect for God's Word, let's stand together and read this together. Genesis 2:24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The Lord add His blessing to the reading of His Word. You may be seated. Marriage is a process of two becoming one. But it's not a process that is problem-free. As a matter of fact, there are problems that occur in marriage in a number of different areas. In the area of communication. I heard the story of this young couple that went to a marriage conference, and the speaker was addressing the men. He says, men, you need to communicate with your wives, and you need to know them. You need to know what their favorite flower is. And this one man turned to his wife and says, that's Pillsbury, isn't it, hon? I won't tell the rest of the story. It's pretty bad from that point on. Communication is an issue, but even so and beyond that, it can even engulf in-laws. I heard the story of this couple driving through the countryside, and they're in the midst of a tiff, going back and forth. And he sees some farm animals out there and gets a sly grin on his face and says, some of your relatives, huh? And she looks and says, yeah, my in-laws. The number one problem in most marriages is money. And you know that money can buy everything except poverty. Think about it. Money is one of those things that causes problems. It's like the lady that was talking to her best friend says, I made my husband a millionaire. And the friend says, well, what was he before you married? And she says, a multimillionaire. Money is one of the things that causes problems in marriage, especially in our society, because we're a very materialistic-oriented society. Everything that we do points to money, and we use money to buy all the toys that we have. The iPads, the computers, the cars, the houses, the clothes, all those different things. And our focus tends to be on things. Now, God's focus is not on things, it's on people and their character. But we have that tendency to focus on things. Marriage is essentially about two people becoming one. And when you merge in this area of money as well. And what we tend to think is that marriage is, especially in the money realm, is a 50-50 proposition. I want to tell you that's wrong. It's not 50-50. It's 100-100. As a matter of fact, one study that I recently read said that the most successful marriages are the ones where the people think, how much can I give, as opposed to how much can I get out of it. And they're more willing to give more of themselves than to take from it. The area of finances is really one in marriage in which really the central issues of faith are built. Can I trust my mate? Can I trust them? And you know, trust is a risky business. It's risky to trust people in the financial area. And therefore, we have to take precautions. And we're not always willing to be open in that area. Today, what I want to do is to look at the overall picture of finances. It has application to whether you're single or married. But I'm speaking specifically to married couples. But it doesn't matter because the principles apply regardless. First thing I want to look at is some financial principles in marriage, but financial principles in general. First and foremost is this: we own nothing. You know, in 1 Timothy 6:7 it says, "For we brought nothing into the world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out." You only own what you take with you. And when you die, how much do you take with you? Nothing. So we don't own anything in this world. We are stewards of all that we have in this world. And God is going to hold us accountable as stewards of the possessions and the money that He entrusts with us. And in the final judgment, it says in Romans 14:12 that every one of us will give account of himself to God. And so we're going to have to give account to God for all that we've done with all the money that we've had and all the possessions that we've had. Have we used them for His honor, His glory? And in marriage, we have to understand that even as a married couple, we own nothing. Second principle is this: we share everything in common. Remember, marriage is a process of becoming what? One. Now, what happens in a marriage situation where each of you have your own separate money, your secret monies? When you set up secret bank accounts and all those other things, what you're doing is you say, I can't trust the other person. And as a result, you're setting yourself up for failure. When you get married, it's together. I don't think that married couples, and I know this will shock some of you, I don't think married couples should have their own individual monies. I think that it's okay for a man or a wife to have their own spending money, but it comes through the budget first, before that occurs. When my wife and I were first married, before we had children and she was working full-time, we gave a certain percentage of her salary to her to spend as she wanted. Whatever. She had her mad money, I had my mad money, but it went through the budget first. Now, I was delighted to give my wife as much spending money as she wanted because she generally spent it on me. Or the house, or, something like that. But the point is, we had our own little spending money, but what we did with it first came through the budget. You have to do that. If you don't do that, you're setting yourself up for questions of integrity, trust, and faith in the other person. So everything is held in common. A third principle: we must live by a budget. Everybody has to live by a budget. In Luke 14:28 it says, "For which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it?" Isn't that budgeting? Understanding how much you got and how much you can spend. Most young couples do not consider budgeting until they're in crisis mode. They've already spent to a point that they're hopelessly in debt, and it's only then that they begin to think about where does it go and how much comes in and all those other things. Now, in marriage, once you establish a budget, somebody in the marriage has to be the one who's accountable to make sure that budget is operated. Now, should it be the husband or the wife? And the answer is the one who's better at the money. There's nothing biblical about man or woman being the one who is accountable. As a matter of fact, you read Proverbs 31, and it talks about a woman who has great success financially. And so as a result, it has nothing to do with gender. Whoever is best at handling money should be the one to handle the funds. So you establish a budget and you live by a budget. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Additionally, we must keep good records. You've got to know where all the money is going. You know, in Proverbs 24:3 it says, "By wisdom is a house built, and by understanding it is established." You've got to know. And if you don't know where you spend it and how much you're spending on what and how to budget. So you've got to keep good records. One study I read said that only 2 out of every 10 couples today knows how to balance their checkbook. That's not good. I know we got a few bankers back there, but you can't trust banks totally and completely. I'm sure many of them strive to be honest and all that other. But you've got to know. I was talking with one guy today, and he said when he first got married, he didn't understand this principle. All they did is write checks, and as long as they cleared, they thought they were fine. Until they got the account, and it had all the overdraft fees and other things. You've got to keep up with your finances. You've got to keep good records. Not long ago, 2 months ago, I went into the bank with a withdrawal slip from my money market account. I gave it to the cashier and gave her a deposit slip to transfer the money into my checking account. 3 weeks later, I got the bank statement and I looked at my checking account and my eyes went, whoo, there wasn't any money in it. Do you know what the bank had done? They had transferred money from my checking account into my checking account. Think about it. And here I had the copy, you know, the photocopies that they sent. And I took them in. The bank says, look at this. And they went, if there's any overdraft fees, we'll pay it. Fortunately, I didn't have any overdraft fees. But if I hadn't checked up on them, what would have happened? It would have just kept going. And it was their mistake. You and I have to understand how much money we got, where it goes, and we got to be able to balance it at the time. I balance my checkbook every month down to the very penny. And if it takes me an hour to do it, I do it. Because it's got to be accurate. You've got to keep good records. Fifth thing. We must learn good financial principles. In Proverbs 14:15 it says, the naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his regards. I think that most people today are not stupid when it comes to their finances, though I think there are many who are ignorant. You know the difference? Stupid means you have no ability to comprehend. Ignorant means you don't have the facts and figures to work with. And I think many people don't understand the principles of when you buy on a credit card and you let them have the interest, that you're paying an enormous amount of interest. I don't know what credit cards are charging today. 10 or more %. And when you buy something with cash, it costs how much percent extra? Nothing. And we don't understand if you allow that money to sit in a credit card and they keep making 10, 15, 20%, they're making a whole lot of money on you and they want you to be in debt. But the principle is this: the borrower is servant to the lender. And you become a slave to the credit card or the people from whom you borrowed money. So you've got to learn basic principles. You've got to understand that if you overdraft your account, the bank makes money on that. And I know they've lowered the rates and fees and all that other stuff. But if you'd bounce a check, they'd charge you $25. And if you overdrafted $5, they'd charge you $25. So that $5 cost you $30. That's not good financial reasoning. You understand that? We have to learn good financial principles and then live by them. Now, what financial principles should we live by? There are 3 that I promote, and I promote them from a biblical standpoint. These are the 3 that I strive to live by myself. The first is this: give generously to the Lord. We should give to the Lord off the top. You know, Proverbs 3:9, honor the Lord with the first fruit of your increase. The first fruit. When you establish a budget, you don't go through the budget and then see how much is left over to give to God. You decide, I'm going to give this much to God, and then what is left over, that's what you live on. That's what you budget. Why do we do that? Because God is the priority. He's the one who gave us all things to begin with. How much do we give? Well, many people promote from the Old Testament the concept of tithing. Tithing just means 10%. And people said, you need to give 10%. Well, that's not what the Old Testament taught. The Old Testament taught that there were 3 tithes that you were to give. 2 tithes you were to give each year. And 1 tithe you were to give every 3rd year. So if you average that out and you're going to use the Old Testament tithing principle, then everyone needs to be given 23 1/3% a year. How often do you hear that taught? Well, we live under the New Testament principle of grace, which says, give out of the grace of your heart. As God has blessed you, give. And so, do I have a percentage that is uniform to anyone here in this church and everyone in the church? The answer is no, I don't. You give as God has blessed you. And if that's 10%, that's a wonderful figure. So's 9.5. So's 22.4. You know, whatever God is motivating you to give, you give. I know one man who promotes tithing, Wally Amos Criswell. Some of you may have heard the name. He was pastor, First Baptist Church in Dallas for years and years, and he promoted tithing. And a number of years ago, and I've shared this illustration before, this guy was so convicted, he came up to Dr. Criswell and says, Dr. Criswell, I know I need to give, so I'm going to start tithing. I only make $40 a week, but I'm going to tithe to that. And God started blessing this man, and before long he's making $500 a week. But you know what happens? The more you make, the less you give. And so this man came to Dr. Criswell and says, Dr. Criswell, I can't afford to give 10% now that I'm making $500 a week. Would you pray for me? And Criswell says, of course I'll pray for you. And he says, Lord, let this man start earning $40 a week again. He could give it 40, but he couldn't give it 500. You get the principle? We need to be giving, and we give off the top and we live off the rest. Second thing I need to say in regard to this is, I really think that our giving should be directed to our local church, whatever that is. Whatever and if I can use this word, tithe, understanding that I'm not meaning a legalistic 10%, but whatever God motivates you. I think our tithe should go first and foremost to the local church because that's where we're encouraged. And God works through the local church. Now, if we want to give more than that, that's fine. But if that's giving to missionaries, if that's giving to other things, I think those are more in the terms of offerings as opposed to our regular scheduled giving. But I think the local church needs to be the focal point of it. And anything above that is the offerings. You know, in our capital campaign that we're kicking off today, what we're asking for are your offerings. That which is above your normal and regular giving, your tithe. We're asking you to to show ownership of these projects which you have approved by your commitment to it. And again, that should be above that normal giving. My wife and I, when we made the decision to give to the capital campaign, at the same moment this was going on, we had a car that we finished paying off. And we thought, well, we just continue that same payment, only redirect it to the church. And that's the way we decided how much we were going to give. And so as a result, it's above what we were already committed to giving. So I think that as a couple, an individual, our giving first goes to the local church, and anything above that is our offerings. I think a third principle is this in our giving. We need to give with a grateful and joyous heart. As 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, so let each one of us give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity. For the Lord loves and let me give you the Greek translation, hilarious giver. God doesn't want you to give out of necessity. God doesn't want you to give until it hurts. God wants you to give until, in the words of Steve Green, some of you may know the singer, he has a children's album. He says, give until it tickles. Hilariously. And that's the way it should be. Giving should be a joy for us. Not a, oh, how am I going to afford to give to God this month? I've got so many bills. No. I give to God out of the joy of my heart, knowing that He has given to me so much, especially His Son. It's also important to remember this when we give generously to the Lord, that the Lord gives to us in proportion to what we give to Him. And what that means is you give and receive God's blessings on the basis of what you give. You know, in 2 Corinthians 9:6 it says, but he who sows sparingly shall reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully shall reap bountifully. Here's the thing. You give this much to God, and you know what God says He'll do to you? He'll give this much back. You give this much to God, and God says, I'll give you that much back. Do you remember what we talked about when we were going through Matthew? With the judgment that you judge, you'll be judged. God does that in terms of giving too. With the proportion that you give, that's the percentage that you want God to return to you. And so you say, only give 0.75%. That's what you're asking God to treat you with. You're saying, God, treat me the way I treat you. God rewards abundantly. You sow bountifully, and God gives bountifully. It demonstrates to Him that we can be trusted with the finances that He gives to us. So we should give bountifully because God's going to give bountifully to us. So the first principle is this. We need to give to God. We need to be generous to Him. The second financial principle we need to live by is this. Spend less than you make. Oh, this is a hard one for us to understand. We live in a society where our government spends more than it makes. That's called deficit spending. And for that reason, we are in trillions and trillions of dollars of indebtedness. Do you know what happens when you spend more than you make? You go in debt, and you go further and further and further in debt, and eventually it collapses. You know what's going to happen to our economy? It's going to collapse. We can't continue to be in deficit spending. And not only that, but you understand, and I don't know the exact percentage, 20 to 40% of everything we take in our budget in America goes to the payment of the debt that we owe. So our $1 trillion indebtedness, our $1 trillion budgets, 20 to 40% of that, we don't even get to benefit from because we're paying for the debt. The same thing happens with couples. All they're doing is paying the interest on their debt, and they're never making progress. You cannot continue to spend more than you take in, though we try. We have to have a balance between earning, spending, and saving. And in marriages, what you find is that God puts different people together. In most marriages, what I find is one person is a spender and one person is a saver. If both people are savers, you're generally okay. The only problems you get into is who gets to save more. If both are spenders, oh, look out. And when one's a saver and one's a spender, then, yeah, there's going to be conflict. In my marriage, I tend to be more of a saver. My wife tends to be more of a spender. Now, the difference is when my wife spends, she spends on little things. You know, sales. When I spend on big things. And then I get depressed for 6 days after I spend it because I want to save. But then, even if it's the right thing to spend for, I still get depressed. What we have to understand is that the reason God generally brings two people in a marriage where one is a spender and one's a saver is to balance each other. A balance so that neither of you spend more than you should, and maybe to motivate one to spend more than they should. You know, that's just part of it. There's a shared responsibility in these decisions. Well, who makes the decision whether you spend or don't spend? Well, that's something you have to share. Two are better than one. So you need to talk about it. I think the final responsibility rests with the husband. I mean, you've heard me say that. But it doesn't mean the husband should always get his way, especially if the wife is the saver or the more accountable one in the financial relationship. You better pay attention to her in these things. Most young couples get into trouble financially because they spend more than they make. They expect to have the same standard of living that their parents did without the amount of time or effort it took to get there. Our self-gratification, our instantaneous gratification in the current generations, it motivates us to get it now. And so we go out and we buy that 60-inch flat screen HD TV, even though we can't afford it, because I want it, rather than save up for it, because we want to satisfy ourselves. We need to learn to spend less than we make. The third principle of finance is this. 1, we give generously to the Lord. 2, we spend less than we make. Third principle is this: save. We need to save funds. What for? I think every person, every couple needs to have a contingency fund. A contingency fund is the amount of money that you save so that if anything happens to you or the family or your income, you will not be destitute in 24 hours. Most financial trainers recommend that an individual or couple have 3 to 6 months of savings. Meaning this: if you were out without a penny of income for 3 months, you'd be able to pay all the bills and continue to live because you have the savings in place. How do you do that? Well, most young couples can't afford to put aside 3 to 6 months instantaneously. It takes time. $5 a week. You say, where do I get $5 a week? Just don't buy that coffee at $5 a cup a day, and you've got 25 a week. And I'm not putting down any brand names. Many people are out there spending $200, $300 a month on coffee. Go to the grocery store, buy a 2-pound bag for $10 and it'll last all month. You just saved $190 and put it in the contingency fund. Quit buying soft drinks. Oh, I've gone from preaching to meddling. Take all the money you'd put into soft drinks and put them into contingency. Oh, here's one, and this will get me thrown out of the church. Don't go out to eat. You understand that by eating out, you could buy 5 meals for every one that you buy at a restaurant. Just go to the grocery store. And so as a result, quit eating out, and you will have money to put in your contingency fund. I'm not opposed to restaurants or going out if you can afford it. You understand that? I'm trying to show you ways that you could save up for your contingency fund. That's all I'm trying to do. You need to have a contingency fund. Or otherwise, a catastrophe happens and you can't pay for it. Back in June, we had an air conditioner go out. Oof, they're expensive. And we paid for it with cash. How do you do that? From our contingency fund. Now, our contingency fund is much smaller, and we have to do what? Build it back up. And when we were first married, we didn't have a 3 to 6 month contingency fund. But we worked on it and developed it so that now we do. So that when emergencies come up, the money's there. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about going into debt because it's taken care of. Have a contingency fund. Second thing, windfalls. You know what a windfall is? It's those unexpected monies that come in, such as your income tax refund. Or you have birthday money that comes in. Or you have a rich uncle that dies and leaves you $1 million or whatever. Maybe it's 100. What do you do with that windfall? Everybody knows what you do with the windfall. Partay! You go out and celebrate and you spend all of it on that 60-inch high-definition flat-screen TV. No! You don't throw yourself a party for being physically irresponsible the rest of the year. What you do is you use those funds to pay off debt or put it into your contingency fund. That's what you do with it. Don't reward yourself for your incompetence. Take it as a gift of God to put away some reserves or to pay down debt. Treat windfalls as they are, opportunities to decrease your indebtedness. Third thing you need to do, you need to save for retirement. You know, the best time to save for retirement is when you're 20 years old. If you save and save diligently between 20 and 30, you generally will save more on the basis of compound interest than between the ages of 30 and 60. And gang, you need to be saving for retirement because you can't trust the government. It's getting worse. You're not going to be able to retire on it in the future. Be careful. Start saving now for retirement. You say, I can't afford it. You can't afford not to. Because if you aren't saving for the future now, you won't have it in the future. Well, what does that mean for us today? What are some life applications? What are some things that I can do financially? Here's some suggestions that I have. First and foremost, discipline ourselves to get out of debt and stay out of debt. You've got to get out of debt. My wife and I are debt-free except for house payments. That's the only thing. Everything else is paid for. Credit card companies don't like me. I do have credit cards. But every month I pay them off. You know how much interest I have paid in the last 30, 35 years on my credit card? I'll give you a hint. Nothing. Credit card companies don't like me. But that's okay. It keeps me out of debt. I use my credit cards as a means to not have to carry money in my wallet. That's all they are there for. Get out of debt. Pay off your house early. How do you do that? One extra payment a year on a 30-year loan will reduce your 30-year loan to 17 and a half years. And on a $100,000 loan will save you about $150,000 over 30 years. Who would you rather have the $130,000? Yourself or the bank? I'll give you a hint. One extra payment a year. Get out of debt. The borrower is servant to the lender. And it limits what you can do. Second applicational principle. Deal with the real issues behind financial conflict in marriage. Generally, when people are arguing about money, there's other issues. And money is just the neutral object that you can blame. And what it does, it creates communication issues. It reminds me of that movie, Cool Hand Luke, with Paul Newman. Strother Martin was the warden in the movie, and he would confront Cool Hand Luke and says, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." That happens in marriage, and generally the failure to communicate is they're not dealing with the real issues behind the financial things. It could be trust, it could be any of a number of different things. Finances just become the means by which they come out. And ultimately what happens is that we lose sight of the real issues. Sometimes couples are afraid to share what they're doing financially because they're making unwise choices and spending where they shouldn't be spending. And if the person knew it, they would have less confidence or trust in them. So deal with the real issues behind finances. And finally, be content with what you have. Again, 1 Timothy 6:6-8, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world and we can't take anything out. Therefore, having food and raiment, let us be content. God hasn't blessed everyone with the same amount. Some He's blessed with much. Some He's blessed with little. As long as we have food and clothing, we should be content. And try to live within the means that God has provided. And if we are able to live within the means God has provided, you know what I find so often? He's willing to bless with more. Not always, but I see it time and time again. As a couple, we need to learn contentedness. Not to always be wanting the newest car, the biggest house, but a willingness to be satisfied with what God has given. Our principles of finance are this. Give generously to God. Spend less than you make, and you do that by the means of a budget. And save. Save. Would you join me in prayer?